Well, I hope a lot of you are reading through the Bible with us this year. We're working on a 3-year project, just getting started, of course, here in the first part of 2025. But we worked our way through the first 11 chapters of Genesis. We're also reading a psalm a day. And so in our podcast, we're going back and forth between what we're reading in the Genesis accounts and the Psalms. Now, that also we're interspersing Job in here, so we'll get to that at the end of the week. But we're going to look at a few of the Psalms together. Psalm 22 today, one of the great Psalms. This Psalm, it kind of serves dual purpose. As normal, David is in trouble, and he's crying out to God in verses 1 and 2, my God, why have you forsaken me? Far from deliverance are the words of my groaning. Oh, my God, I cry out day by day, but you do not answer, and by night, but I have no rest. So, as is often the case, David is some kind of an issue, some kind of a problem, and he needs help. He's reminding himself that God has answered in the past. Verse 4, in you our fathers trusted, they trusted, and you delivered them. And they were not disappointed, verse 5. But the fact that the Lord has delivered in the past, and he hopes that the Lord will deliver now, doesn't take away the sting of what he's going through, the pain of suffering. There's a principle of Scripture here. The Lord is faithful, and the Lord is with us, but that doesn't necessarily mean the pain and the suffering and the hurt go away automatically by any means. So as David cries out to the Lord, he's looking at some of the reasons why he's suffering, why he's going through the difficult times. And as he looks at his own life and his own history and knows that the Lord has helped him in the past, look at verse 10. He says, you have been my God from my mother's womb. Be not far from me, for trouble is near, for there is none to help. So he knows that the Lord has been with him in the past, but he's just crying out the Lord will be with him again. And so David works through that, and he knows ultimately that God will make all things right. In verses 26 to 31, we have a lot of that. Verse 24, at the end, he says, but when he cried to him for help, he heard. All the way down to verse 31, he knows that the Lord is going to be there with him. Verse 28, for the kingdom is the Lord's, and he rules over the nation. So he's not really questioning God's sovereignty or God's ability to rescue him. But at this point, he is struggling to find some grounding at this point. He's hurting, and he's crying out to God. Now, like I said, this is a dual-purpose psalm. Of all the psalms in the Old Testament that prophesy about things that Jesus would do or things that would be done to Jesus, this is the one that contains the most prophecies fulfilled. So this is a messianic psalm, speaking of the Lord himself, the Messiah who would come. And there's a number of places that we have direct prophecies fulfilled, things that Jesus would do and say, and also things that were done to him. Let's take a look at these. There's several of them. Verse 1, you're probably familiar with the very first line, my God, why have you forsaken me? These are words Jesus cried out from the cross itself. And while he was on the cross, there were 7 different utterances that Jesus made from the cross, and this was one of them toward the end of his time on the cross, crying out, Lord, why have you forsaken me? Now, David's asking that as well. This is not simply a prophetic messianic psalm. David, too, is questioning why God would seem to be forsaking him, but the Lord himself would do this on the cross. And then we drop down to verse 7, and it says, all who see me sneer at me. And we know that the Lord was mocked. He was mocked by the Roman soldiers. He was mocked by the Jewish leadership and by different people. Eventually, the Lord suffered the mockery and the insults of people, as David apparently did as well here. In verse 14, on the cross, we find that it says here, all my bones are out of joint. My heart is like wax, it's melted within me. We find that none of Jesus' bones were broken. We find that in another prophetic passage. They did not break any of his bones, but by putting him on the cross and by being on the cross and pushing that cross into the ground, there would be a great jar that we know from other instances throughout history that would knock the joints out, knock a person's joints out. So Jesus went through that. In verse 16, he says, they pierced my hand and my feet, direct reference to Jesus. We don't know of anything like that for David, but Jesus went through that piercing. By the way, this is the only place in Scripture that clearly, directly says that his feet would be pierced. So we don't see that in the narrative passages in the New Testament, but it's prophesied here. So we believe that was the case. And then in verse 18, it says that they divided my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots, directly fulfilled by the guards at the feet of the cross when Jesus died. So this is a prophecy of Jesus. This is a psalm that points to Christ, but David also identifies with many of the things that are going on here as well. Wonderful psalm.